You ever notice how some things in language, like the simplest things, can be like surprisingly tricky?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to dive into one of those today.
Okay.
Those little words that we use all the time, like
Yeah.
his and her, without a second thought.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? They're so tiny.
Yeah.
But they cause so many problems for learners.
Yeah. What makes them so tricky?
Well,
It feels like we learn those super early on.
you'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But language learning, it isn't like flicking a switch.
Right.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
It's a process.
Like climbing a ladder. You don't just like
Right.
magically appear at the top rung.
Exactly. Step by step.
All
Each
in.
one builds on the one before.
So is there a method to the madness when someone mixes up his and her?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is these stages, they often kind of mirror the influence of the learner's first language.
Okay.
It shapes how they approach the new one.
That makes sense. Because if you grow up with certain rules, it's only natural to like try to apply them in a new language, even if they don't actually work.
Yeah, it's like trying to fit square blocks into round holes.
Right.
You know, eventually you figure out that they need to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But you got to try it first.
You got to try it first.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me more about these stages.
Okay.
What are some of the common like stepping stones that learners go through?
At the very beginning, learners will often rely on really familiar terms.
Okay.
So they might use the definite article that, or even your as a kind of placeholder for possessive determiners
Oh, interesting.
while they're still figuring things out.
So they might say something like, the boy play with the ball is the boy.
Precisely. It might sound a bit odd
Yeah.
to a native ear,
Yeah.
but it's a completely natural step in the process.
What?
They're piecing together how possession works in this new language.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
So what happens after that initial stage? Do they start using his and her more?
Exactly. As learners progress, they start experimenting with his and her,
Okay.
but they might show a bit of a preference for one over the other.
Okay.
Initially,
Yep.
they're kind of like trying to figure out all the ways that this new tool in their toolbox works.
Oh, I can picture that. So this is already making me look at these words in a whole new light.
Yeah,
So when do things start to click into place?
right.
When do they kind of get a handle on his and her?
So that brings us to a critical stage where things get really interesting and where
Okay.
we see these fascinating influences from a learner's first language really come to the forefront.
Okay, now you've got me hooked.
All right.
Let's talk about what happens in those sort of like more advanced stages.
So we left off talking about learners starting to experiment with his and her.
Right.
So let's imagine that we're observing a French speaker learning English.
Okay. I'm picturing them like confidently using those words, but maybe not always getting it quite right.
Exactly.
Okay.
They might say something like this. The mother is dressing her little boy, and she put her clothes, her pants, her coat, and then she finished.
Okay, I see. So they're using her consistently,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not always like matching up with what we would consider the possessor to be
Yeah.
in English.
They've grasped the concept.
Right.
They're using possessive determiners,
Yeah.
but they're applying it based on a different set of rules.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what happens next? How do they bridge that gap?
So this is where we start to see those aha moments start to happen.
Okay.
Right. So learners begin to differentiate
Okay.
between his and her,
Okay.
but there's still a layer of complexity,
Okay.
right? So in English, we use natural gender,
Right.
matching his with males and her with females.
Right.
But in French, grammatical gender reigns supreme.
Right.
So
So it's not about the actual gender.
exactly.
It's about the gender of the word.
Yeah.
It's like the grammatical gender.
the grammatical gender of the noun.
Okay.
So a French speaker learning English might say this. The girl fell on her bicycle. She look his father and cry.
Okay.
Now you and I,
Yeah.
we would naturally say her father.
Her father, because in English, father is male.
Exactly.
So we use his.
Yes.
But in French, the word for father, père, is grammatically masculine.
Yes.
So the learner is applying that possessive determiner that they would use in French.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Wow.
Right. So it's like they're translating directly from their first language,
Wow.
which leads to these kind of systematic errors
Right.
that actually reveal a really deep understanding of linguistic structures.
That's incredible. It's like a little window into how their brain is mapping this new language onto their existing knowledge.
It's a fascinating process, isn't it?
It really is.
And what's even more interesting is this influence can linger,
Okay.
even as learners become more proficient. So they might master most aspects
Okay.
of possessive determiners,
Yeah.
but still stumble
Yeah.
in these specific contexts.
So even when they reach that final stage
Yeah.
where they're using his and her accurately, there might still be those little echoes of their first language.
Exactly. It just highlights how deeply intertwined our native languages with our understanding of the world, even when we're learning a new one.
This is reminding me of something else you mentioned earlier, which is that like his and her are just one piece of the language puzzle.
Right.
What are some of the other areas where we see this fascinating interplay between a learner's first language and their attempts to master English?
So another big one is the way that learners handle relative clauses. So those phrases that give us extra information about a noun, like the book that I read.
Right, okay.
So that's a relative clause.
Okay, relative clauses. Those are always fun.
Yeah.
What makes them particularly challenging for learners?
It's not so much that they're difficult in themselves, but some types of relative clause are trickier than others. Particularly for learners whose first language structures them differently.
Right.
So imagine it like a ladder of complexity. Learners kind of have to climb it step by step.
So certain relative clause structures are like those higher rungs.
Precisely.
A little bit more of a stretch.
Yeah. And just like with those possessive determiners, we see those real aha moments when learners start to grasp the nuances.
This is making me think about all those kind of like hidden complexities of language that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
It's like we've been speaking prose our entire lives and never realized it.
It's true. We do. You know, we often don't appreciate just how intricate a system it is that we're navigating every time we open our mouths to speak.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about possessive determiners. We've talked about relative clauses.
Yes.
Are there any other sort of fascinating linguistic hurdles?
Oh, plenty.
All right.
But one that comes to mind is mastering verb tenses. Specifically, how to talk about past events. Just like with possessive determiners. There are predictable stages here, too.
I've definitely noticed that. Like, learners will sometimes use past tenses in ways that sound a little off to a native speaker. What causes those kinds of errors?
Well, every language has its own way of expressing the past, right? English has a whole system of past tenses. But other languages might do things differently. They might have a different way of dividing up time or different ways of marking whether an action is completed or ongoing.
So someone coming from a language that has a different way of talking about the past might try to, like, map their existing knowledge onto English.
Exactly.
Even if it doesn't quite line up.
Yeah, and this is where we see those cross-linguistic influences really coming into play. So, for example, French often uses a form that looks a lot like the present perfect tense in English. I have eaten, to talk about past events. Even in situations where English would use the simple past, I ate.
So a French speaker might say, like, I have eaten breakfast this morning.
Exactly.
Instead of I ate breakfast this morning.
Precisely. And it's not that they don't understand the concept of the past tense. Their brain is just trying to find the closest equivalent in English based on what it already knows.
Wow, it's incredible how all these kind of like little influences from our first language shape the way that we learn a new one.
Absolutely.
It's like we carry this sort of like linguistic history with us wherever we go.
We do.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
Any final takeaways for our listeners?
Remember, language learning is a journey. Not a race. Everyone progresses at their own pace. And those mistakes that you make, they're not failures.
They're stepping stones. Showing that you are actively figuring out this puzzle.
I love that. Errors are just proof that learning is happening.
Exactly.
Like those kind of light bulb moments. They wouldn't be as exciting if we hadn't gone through a bit of darkness first.
Exactly. And you know what? Here's a thought to leave you with. Pay attention to how people around you use language.
Okay.
Especially children and language learners.
Yeah.
See if you can spot any of the stages or influences that we've talked about today.
I love that. So it's like a real-world treasure hunt for language lovers.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of his, her, and the surprising complexities of language.
It's been fun.
It has. Until next time.